Good evening, everyone. I'm Jo Ritali, State Library Victoria's Director of Collections. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the 2020 Stephen MurraySmith Memorial Lecture. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm speaking to you from. I'm lucky to be in the beautiful Bayside area, which is the land of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which you are joining us from tonight. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to the elders of all other communities. Well, in the normal course of events, we would be gathered in Melbourne at the beautifully redeveloped State Library. But for now, as we keep each other safe, this is how we come together. I'd like to give a very warm welcome to our guest speaker, Erik Jensen, members of the MurraySmith family, members of the Library Board of Victoria and Foundation Council, and to all our friends and supporters. This memorial lecture honours the life and work of Stephen MurraySmith, an academic and founding editor of Overland magazine. Stephen was an historian, a man of letters, an activist, a public intellectual, and an environmentalist. He was one of Australia's great thinkers, and his impact on Australian political, cultural, and literary thought was significant. When Stephen died in 1988, he left behind a remarkable collection of personal papers and other records dating back to the 1930s. The library acquired these papers in 1990. Since 1992, the Stephen MurraySmith Memorial Lecture has commemorated Stephen's contribution to Australian intellectual life and promoted research and debate in areas of his interest and influence. Over 3 decades, the lecture has been delivered by a remarkable and passionate group of Australians, including Geoffrey Searle, Robert Mann, Barry Jones, Janet Holmes-a-Court, Don Watson, Malcolm Fraser, Anne Summers, Bruce Pascoe, Alexis Wright, and most recently, John Fain. Tonight, we have the pleasure of hearing from Erik Jensen. Erik Jensen is the award-winning author of Acute Misfortune and On Kate Jennings. He is founding editor of the Saturday paper and editor-in-chief of Schwartz Media. Erik has written for film and television and was the winner of the Walkley Award for Young Print Journalist of the Year and the United Nations Association of Australia's Media Peace Award. Erik's lecture is titled The Man with No Face. It addresses difficult and uncomfortable issues that cut to our nation's moral and ethical core. When Erik Jensen was editor of the Saturday paper, he encountered a photograph of 31-year-old asylum seeker Hamed Shamshiripour, taken after he died by suicide on Manus Island in 2017. Erik chose not to publish the picture. He still regrets that decision. Tonight, Erik will speak about anger, objectivity, and a feature of national politics he calls the Australian facelessness, the way we other people and then disappear them from our minds. I expect it will be a powerful address. Please note, this lecture does address the subject of suicide. If you find this troubling or need support, please call Lifeline on 131114. Please welcome Erik Jensen.
I'm giving this lecture from my office, and I want to acknowledge that this is the land of the Rotary people of the Kulin Nation, and say that this land was never ceded, it was taken by violence and legal fiction, and that until, as a country, we acknowledge that fact and we acknowledge that Dispossession and colonization are continuous acts that continue until this day. We will not be able to say that we are a truly moral nation, or one that is engaged with reality. In the dream, he has no face. He is sitting on a couch, leaning forward as if to adjust something. There is a pine coffee table and a lamp in the room. The furniture is brown, except for one chair, which is green. When he looks up, he is the dead man from the photograph. He is Hamed Shamshiripour. He is wearing the same pink polo shirt, the same loose blue trousers. His arms are thin almost to wasting, and his head is shaved bald. Hamed's eyes are empty and the sockets are so large they've eclipsed his other features. I had been having this nightmare for 3 months. It started in August when Hamed killed himself. For a few days, I kept the photograph on my desk at the Saturday paper, deciding whether or not to run it. When people came into my office, I turned it over so that they could not see it. In the photograph, there is no couch or coffee table. There is just the forest and the tree from which Hamed is hanging. At the time, we chose not to publish this picture. His family found it too distressing. I spoke to one of his friends on Manus Island, an asylum seeker, who said, "From the first time I saw that picture, I could not forget it. Not because of how he was, because I saw myself." I wrote at the time that it looked like the scene of a lynching, and that it was. I wrote that Hamed's shoulders hung as if responding to a question for which there was no answer. I wrote that our government was responsible for his death, and I believe that deeply. More than that, I believe we are responsible for our government. Hamed killed himself after he'd been assessed as a refugee. He killed himself after Border Force's chief medical officer had been made aware of the dire state of his mental health. Australia had refused to honour his wishes to be returned to the country from which he was fleeing. Hamed Shamshiripour killed himself because he could not escape the hell Australia had made for him. He was trapped in the most evil part of our politics, and no one in power cared enough to know that he was there or to work to change this fact. His life had already been traded for votes. This was not an accident. He killed himself not because the system we'd built was malfunctioning. He killed himself because the system had worked just as it was intended to work. In this country, we call it a deterrent. I've been thinking about this photograph again recently after watching the video of George Floyd's murder. I've been thinking about the way that images can contribute to change. And because of this, I've been thinking about the murder of Emmett Till and the picture of his death. Till was killed by racists in Mississippi in 1955. He was beaten and shot, his body tied to a gin flan and thrown in the Chattahoochee River. He was 14 years old. Till's mother, Mammy, chose to bury him in an open casket. She wanted the world to see the crimes that it had committed against her son. A photograph of Till's face, horribly disfigured, ran in Jet magazine and then elsewhere. For many, this was a key moment in the civil rights movement. The photograph changed how people saw the world. The poet Claudia Rankine wrote that Mammy Till forced on our day-to-day a new kind of logic. She had insisted that we look with her upon the dead. Australia has never buried an Emmett Till, although we have killed people just like him. Since 1991, 441 Indigenous Australians have died in police custody. No officer has ever been convicted over these deaths. 2 weeks after Till was murdered, an all-white jury deliberated for less than an hour before finding his killers innocent. The state chose not to pursue the lesser charge of kidnap. In this country, in Australia, we rarely see the faces of our dead. We do not know the names of the people we lock up. It is almost impossible to speak to someone in prison. Journalists are routinely taken off call lists. Justice is conducted with greater secrecy than in perhaps any other democracy on earth, hidden behind a mounting use of suppression orders and in courtrooms closed to the world by arcanum. Entire systems have been built to hide us from the people that we damage. Offshore detention is a legal trick, a Howard-era grift to deny people access to our laws. But it had another useful consequence. It made people invisible. In these prisons, men and women and children are given numbers in place of names. Visas are denied to journalists who wish to visit them. As I write, the Minister for Home Affairs, Peter Dutton, is pursuing laws to ban mobile phones in detention centres. He also wants greater powers to strip search asylum seekers and to use dogs. The United Nations has warned against this. The Australian Medical Association has pointed out the risk of self-harm. Dutton does not care. The laws are necessary because the taking of these phones is otherwise illegal. The federal court has already found as much. This legislation serves no purpose but to hide people, to cut them off from the world. It will take from asylum seekers their last connection to the outside. I would call this the Australian facelessness. We are the people, and then we disappear them. You cannot photograph decisions. In one way or another, this is the point of an essay Teju Cole wrote in the middle of last year, after a number of news outlets ran a photograph of Oscar Alberto Martinez Moreira and his baby daughter Valeria face down in the Rio Grande. Trapped in a decision, in Donald Trump's metering process, they had tried to swim to Texas. They were killed by bureaucracy, by a policy that made their lives too slow to bear. Their drowning was only the final part of this, the end of a long, deliberate process. In America, unlike here, the outcomes of cruel politics wash up at their borders. Cole wrote, "Momentous political decisions, often made by men in suits in quiet, evenly lit rooms, do not tend to generate visual drama." He wrote, "Do we need the spectacle of corpses to make the story real?" This last point Cole underscored later in the essay. He felt that these images changed nothing, that they simply proved the asymmetry between those who suffer and the readers of newspapers who later observe their suffering. Cole wondered what sort of person would need to see such a photograph in order to know what they should already know. Who would need to see this brutality, and what kind of brutality would be enough? Cole wrote, and I'm quoting here, "These photographs are mirrors, not windows. We look into them, and what they reflect back to us is something monstrous and hard to reconcile with our notion of ourselves. We look, and then, sated with looking, secure in our reactions, perennially missing the point, we put them away." Reading this, I felt the discomfort of knowing something to be true, but wishing that it was not. In these moments, it is as if you can feel your subconscious twisting, squirming to find a new shape, like a worm pulled up from the soil. Cole's essay sent me to reread Susan Sontag, in particular her book Regarding the Pain of Others. It is a book I've given to reporters who are going to cover trauma. It is a reminder of the gravity of what we do and the honesty we should apply to why we do it. The book begins with Virginia Woolf imagining an end to war. She imagines this by describing the shared horror at seeing photographs of fascist bombings in Spain. Sontag counters that now not even pacifists believe war could be abolished, stopped, as Woolf puts it. Woolf's argument is unpicked, Sontag says, by the unchanging 60 years of battle and conflict that followed it. Sontag notes that photographs of war are a species of rhetoric. They reiterate, they simplify, they agitate, they create the illusion of consensus. It occurs to me that for as long as photography has existed, there has existed the hope that photographs would make the world better, that somehow they will capture a truth with which there is no argument, and that on the lee side of this may be peace. That maybe the world happens too fast, and if we could slow it down to single terrible frames, we could see it all and make sense of it. This is the effect the photograph of Hamed had on me. This is what I am trying to work through. Sontag describes the belief that if the horror could be made vivid enough, most people would finally take in the outrageousness and the insanity of war. She spends the rest of her small book carefully and with great precision, destroying this premise. She traces the manipulation of the image and the hypocrisy of its mission. She points to the objectification of photography, to the barbarism, the hopelessness, and the gore of human nature, and the presence always of wickedness and inhumanity. She explores how the vast flow of images habituates us to depravity, and in doing so, makes us numb. She writes how images themselves can undo reality because of what they are. In one section, she describes a woman in Sarajevo who forgives the world its indifference because she herself would be indifferent were it not her city being bombed. A more troubling idea waits a few pages on, that sympathy is a passport to innocence. As Sontag puts it, so far as we feel sympathy, we feel we are not accomplices to what caused the suffering. This is a profound challenge to journalists who earlier she calls those professionals specialized tourists. Sympathy is the outcome of our craft. We are praised even for the words that elicit it, but here very clearly we are confronted by its limits. Worse, we see its conceit. What is the purpose of sympathy if all it does is free the reader from guilt? What does it mean to write about deaths in custody or abuses against people living in poverty or government cruelty if nothing changes, if all we do is create for our reader the warm water of sympathy? Probably when Sontag wrote her essay, she didn't know that somebody would photograph her death. I remember seeing these pictures just after my 22nd birthday, taken by her partner, and thinking, this is what love might look like. I remember the deathly streak in Sontag's hair, the surprise at seeing her thin leg poking out from beneath a sheet, the spray of a moth orchid behind her. I remember thinking that maybe she died as rigorously as she had lived. I remember this picture making me feel something like a greater new part of being human. And for that, I was grateful that it existed. This doesn't answer to Cole's challenge. It doesn't say what level of brutality a comfortable person must see before they demand change. All it says is that a single image can alter a person's reality, can make in one frame the whole nature of their existence stretched and larger and more complete. When I dreamt of Hamed, I would wake with a start. Sometimes I would be anguished. Once I woke crying. Other times I would wake with a blistered kind of anger, and I would stay angry as I walked to work, and I would stay angry at my desk, and sometimes I would hear a siren in my ears as if the world was screaming. What is it that I want? For other people to feel this same anguish? Do I want them to wake crying? Do I want them to feel a surging anger, the kind that beats in their temples like a headache? Probably yes. Probably I want them to feel angry, and then I want them to do something with it. I want the outrages of life to outrage them. I want them to see those things we do to make ourselves comfortable and to be discomforted by them. Ultimately, I did nothing productive with this anger. Possibly I used it to insulate myself against the world, to feel something that I believed made me different and as such less culpable. Recently, I read a speech that Audre Lorde gave in Connecticut in 1981. She talked about a rage that trembled under harness. The image caught me off guard, the idea of anger like a racehorse, its muscles twitching, readying to move with great speed down the track. Lorde talked about this anger as a powerful source of energy. She wanted it freed from this harness. In her own life, she'd used it to propel her through the world, the rage of being a woman and of being Black and being treated differently because of this. In her speech, Lorde offered a definition of anger to distinguish it from hatred. Anger, she said, is a grief of distortions between peers, and its object is change. Lorde would not hide her anger to spare someone else their guilt. She saw these two things as being connected, rage and guilt, action and impotence. She said, and I'm quoting, "I have no creative use for guilt, yours or my own. Guilt is only another way of avoiding informed action, of buying time out of the pressing need to make clear choices, out of the approaching storm that can feed the earth as well as bend the trees." Later in the same speech, she said, "My anger has meant pain to me, but it has also meant survival. And before I give it up, I'm going to be sure that there is something at least as powerful to replace it with on the road to clarity." Anger scares me. I was raised to suppress it. From the time I was born, I have hidden from it, and even now I avoid it in myself and in other people. It horrifies me because it represents chaos. In my mind, it is dangerous and it is violent. I realize this is wrong, however, that anger is a discrediting force, because to embrace it would be to embrace change. We judge anger to keep us safe from the things we have already done. In journalism, anger is almost forbidden. The angry writer has lost his sacred objectivity. He can no longer make sense of the world because all he sees is distorted by it, distorted by the rage. Worse, he refuses to accept the world as it is. He wants too much to change it. But how can you be truly curious and remain dispassionate? Aren't the journalists who claim not to feel horror or anger the ones who haven't looked hard enough? I'm reminded of the American columnist Jack Newfield, who built his reputation on the Village Voice. His work was driven by the anger he felt at corruption and cronyism in New York City, and the empathy he had for the people it affected, the people who were left in condemned buildings or exposed to toxic materials, or whose children were denied proper schools because of a deal made someplace else between men that they would never meet. He saw anger as central to journalism, and increasingly I see this also. Compassion without anger can become merely sentiment or pity, he wrote. Knowledge without anger can stagnate into mere cynicism and apathy. Anger improves lucidity, persistence, audacity, and memory. I think all of this is true. I think a world of pity and cynicism is less confronting to those in power than one of persistence, audacity, and change. And this is why we are taught to fear anger. In the second of his Boyer lectures, in the one he called The Great Australian Silence, Bill Stanner talked about the elision of Indigenous viewpoints from our history, something like a cult of forgetfulness practiced on a national scale. He said there was no accident in this. The forgetting was too grand for that. It had become a habit. This level of exclusion had made it nearly impossible for white Australia to bring Indigenous people into mind. Stanner's point was that this failure in the writing of history made it impossible for white Australia to engage with Indigenous Australians. It affected all kinds of policy. For more than a century, it caused us to misunderstand the country, to not grasp its interior, to fail to comprehend the land itself. Stanner argued that the Great Australian Silence could not survive the young people working to end it. He was wrong. Young people become old people in too little changes. The shift in power between generations is stubborn and slow in this country, and what Stanner predicted in 1968 has still not come true. The lectures have dated, the language has become difficult and condescending, but nothing really has changed. A while ago, I was at a dinner to celebrate an exhibition of Roman objects from the British Museum. I was sitting with a curator who said museums struggled to collect the history happening in front of them. She said this was especially true in Australia. It made sense to me. We are a country afraid of our own history. It is not because we are ignorant of it, but the opposite. We know what happened, or some version of it, and the thought of being held accountable is too much to bear. Stanner talks at one point about dropped threads. He doesn't mean it in a sense, but I think there is a fear of what will unravel if our history is pulled at in any way. Something as simple as changing the date of our national celebrations or asking questions of a statue could see the whole project of Australia fall apart. The problem is, we've become so used to lying that we can't tell the truth. Because of this, we live in an incomplete presence. Nothing makes sense or holds up to scrutiny. The contortions of avoiding the past make the honesty of a national identity almost impossible. The Australian facelessness is the natural extension of this. We are a nation that has learnt not to see, and that has become the truth of who we are. Like so much in our politics, the Australian facelessness is about comfort. There is very little Australians will not do for comfort. We lock up people because we fear they will steal our comfort. And we do this at a great remove, keep them at great distance to avoid the discomfort of admitting what it is we are intending. This fear is an old one. It goes back to Federation and before. Once it was about armies coming from the north. Now it is about the desperate and the fleeing who want some part of the life we already have. Hamed Shamshiripour died because we were worried this country would be less comfortable if he was living in it. We don't talk about this, but we accept it. We vote in great numbers for two parties who promise to do the same thing to Hamed and to men like him, and who promise we won't have to see their faces, talk about what it is we've done. We do this to First Nations people, to people living in poverty, to anyone who has not succeeded in being comfortable and whose failure at this we shun lest we be asked to fix it. In the months before Hamed died, leaked documents showed that for more than a year, contractors had been making conditions in detention more and more difficult. They called this a scaled service delivery approach. What they called conditions and entitlements were to be made more attractive for those who complied. Eventually, it was hoped, some refugees would just go home. Comfort is the promise of our politics, but it is also its great weapon. Since the year 2000, at least 59 people have died in immigration detention. Some have been denied medicine or beaten to death, although the ones I am talking about here have been starved or hanged or set alight. These are people punished for a crime that does not exist. At a certain point, the taking of a person's liberty and of their hope is so total, so complete, that their actions are no longer their own, but the actions of the system they've been forced to live inside. These deaths cannot properly be called suicides because they are state-sanctioned murders. The bipartisanship around these deaths, the absolute dedication to our national obsession with borders, means that for 2 decades we have, as a country, been voting in favour of them. When I was about 12, I read Doris Lessing's novel Briefing for a Descent into Hell. I'd picked up the book at my grandmother's house because at that moment I felt the title was the story of my being alive. I don't recall much of the book. I remember dog-like creatures on an island barking and giving birth. There was one line, though, that stuck in my head then and has been stuck there since. And inside were 11 men, my friends, whom I knew better than I knew myself, since we do know our friends better than we know ourselves. It is a startlingly inconsequential sentence, yet it lodged there so clearly. As I was writing this, I telephoned my nan to check the line because I didn't have a copy of the book, and there it was almost exactly as I remembered it. When I was 12, the phrase felt true and also tragic. I didn't know myself, and I probably never would. Now I see that sentence as the point of my life. To understand other people, to know them so we might know ourselves. When Hamed's friend told me that in that terrible picture he saw himself, he was telling me the story of his own reality. Photographs are not just about what has happened, but what might happen, and in this way they are a form of empathy. If this man on the phone saw himself in the picture, why would other men not? What does it take to feel another person's suffering as if it is your own? What does it take to look at a photograph and feel what it depicts as if it is happening to you right there in that instant? I write biography because I believe it is from each other's stories that we make our humanity. Because I believe this, I believe that the Australian facelessness keeps us from our humanity. I believe that if we avoid looking, we will never truly see. Some other things I believe. I believe a nation has a soul. I believe that the actions of our politicians are the actions of all of us. I believe that because we have no Bill of Rights and are unique in this among developed nations, the soul of our country is extremely vulnerable. I regret not running the picture of Hamed Shamshiripour. I regret it because I know that we, all of us, conspired together to kill him. We should have to see what we've done, what it looks like to be this comfortable. Surely this should make you angry enough to demand that we change. Surely we can demand that we see the faces of the people who are hurt by our politics. I don't know anything real about Hamed Shamshiripour. I never spoke with him. I never learned from him the things we passed from one another to make humanity. All I know is that he is dead and that he shouldn't be. That he died only because he wanted to be free, and we denied to him that freedom. I want people to feel angry. You should be angry, and if not, why not? You killed a man you never met and never would meet, whose face you will never see, whose death, if you avoid thinking too much about it, gives you the comfort of the life that you are living right now. Thank you for listening to this speech.
Thank you, Erik. That was tremendously powerful. You have given us a lot to think about and some hard truths to contemplate. It's now your chance to ask Erik your questions. You can submit your questions via the Slido question function, and we'll get through as many as we can. Let's start with this question. So how much are journalists censored by the big corporations that they work for? Is there such a thing as free and fearless journalism in Australia?
I think there is free and fearless journalism in Australia. I think there can and should be more of it also. It depends, publisher by publisher, how journalism works. There is no standard or simple rule for the kind of journalism that we have. But increasingly, journalism is about audiences and serving audiences. Journalism is less and less about big corporations and power and more about subscribers and readers. And for that reason, it is readers who can ask for fearless journalism. It is readers who can ask for journalism that is angry and wants this country to change, for journalism that is not satisfied with the status quo, for journalism produced by people who live outside the status quo. Those are all things that readers can ask for, because big corporations that own newspapers might be less interested in that.
Thank you. And another really good question, how do we have this conversation with those who do not occupy our political and cultural silos, those sort of extraordinary people we all know?
By talking to them, I think. If we're concerned with the production of a common humanity, we need to talk to people with whom we disagree. But we also need to talk to people who are not like us, not just people who come from elsewhere on the political spectrum. We need to make space in conversations for people whose voices we don't ordinarily hear. I think that question is often asked to be about argument, to be about how we confront someone at a dinner table. In lots of ways, I'm more interested in how we find space for the voices who are never going to be at that dinner table. And I think because we have a very divided politics in this country, we spend a lot of time thinking about, the difference between people on the right and left in this country. And we don't spend a lot of time thinking about the people who are never even part of that conversation. And I think if we can start talking to the people who are not part of that conversation, forcing ourselves to look at the people damaged by our politics, it won't matter which side of politics you're on if you can be confronted by the realities of what our politics does.
I think I would love to go to a dinner party where those people were actually there rather than the usual suspects. Erik, if sympathy isn't enough, if both sides of politics support the same cruel incarceration, how do we start to create change? Is anger enough?
Anger is an engine for change. Anger of itself is not enough. But we have been for decades in this country voting in spite of the most obscene and brutal policies and pretending like our votes don't contribute to the absolute destruction of people's lives. And we don't have to do that. And it doesn't mean that people who have for a long time been voting Labor and pretending like this isn't also Labor's problem need to stop voting for Labor. It means that they need to start talking to the people that they want to vote for and telling them that they cannot vote for policies such as these. And that's something that each of us can do. We are all with a vote in this country and all represented in this parliament. And I do think a lot of us pretend like offshore detention, for instance, is not our problem. But it is. And the fact that both parties have the same policy on it, even though most people's vote is not decided by it, means that people's vote should be decided by it, but just decided in the opposite direction to those votes that have for all of this time been what, politicians convince themselves are necessary to win power in marginal seats.
Great. How can we protect the freedom of expressions when there are cases like Assange, an Australian citizen, detained in the UK without a formal sentence?
Again, by making sure that our government properly defends an Australian citizen who is facing extradition to a situation that is appalling for him in the US. by asking our local members to make sure that this is, in fact, for them a priority. And, maybe it is naive, but I do believe if we continue to embrace truth and put primacy on the idea of truth in our politics, that we will have a better politics. And although, the Assange case is an appalling example of the way in which power rejects criticism, it is only through more criticism that power will change.
Here's a really good question. I think we'd all be really interested in your response. How might we address the fake news cycle, the constant demeaning of news that is not welcome, such as, the subjects that you've been speaking about?
I think the idea of addressing malicious fake news, news that is created for social platforms with the intention of misleading, is one that the major platforms can themselves begin to address. It goes to questions of media literacy that also need to be taught to people, particularly people using platforms and news sources with which they're unfamiliar. As troubling as that to me, though, and more insidious, I think, is the way in which mainstream politics can dismiss stories with which they disagree as being fake news. And I think it is incumbent on us all of us, to find a way to build a robust and properly resourced press so that the dismissal of stories that are actually in the national interest cannot happen. And this is about very simple things like subscribing to titles that you wish to see grow and that you wish to see, continue journalism that you trust. I think there's a real belief that the internet has taken away truth, and that we may never get it back. I don't believe that to be the case. I think more troubling is that politics has given up on truth, and that's what I would like to get back first.
Great. I know you talked about regretting not publishing the photograph. Do you worry, though, that if the public sees a lot of images of suffering that we become desensitized or that we just simply turn away to avoid being traumatized? Do we need to kind of use them for impact and be selective about how we use them?
I would say I don't think we should ever be using an image. I think Hamed Shamshiripour was a man whose life had become so horribly constricted that he was unable to live it because of a system that we built. And while I regret not running the image taken after he died, I would struggle even now to reconcile running it without his family's enthusiasm. And this is an issue that we have to confront as journalists. I don't worry about us being desensitized by what it is we read and what it is we see, because we are so capable as a people of avoiding the reality of our politics, that stories like the Dondale Youth Detention story can appear in print and not register on the national conscience until an image is shown of the very same boy in a spit hood restraint, deprived of all liberty and dignity. It is only occasionally in seeing images that we decide to make change. And I think that is because the brain is almost unable to conjure up the truth of words on a page if what is on that page so appalls us that we don't want to imagine it. And we, as a country, I think the point of my speech in some ways is that we're very good at not imagining. And so I'm not worried about desensitizing. I'm interested in people waking up.
Great. We've got time for one more question. And I'm sorry, people who have sent in questions that we aren't going to have time to get to. So as a journalist, can your desire for change and your anger at current events drive your career? And is there a pathway to channel this kind of journalism?
I think so. I mean, I think all of us need to find those things that make us angry and ask why they make us angry and ask who's allowed to be angry in Australia. I think that, I don't address it in this speech, but there is a lot of anger in the Australian media. It's just that the only people who are allowed to be angry are the people defending the status quo. You're allowed to be a man on breakfast radio very angry at anyone seeking to take away the power that you've taken for granted your entire life and for generations before you. You're not allowed to be angry if what you're asking for is people to pay attention to something they're doing that they shouldn't. And, if the question is, does anger stop certain people from participating in the press because the press rejects them for being angry? I think absolutely. I think I want us to normalize anger so it is used to explore the reality of the world. So, so anger can be a divining rod to point out those things that deserve to change, as opposed to a battering ram that stops things from changing.
That's great. Thank you. That's all the questions that we have time for. So thank you again, Erik, for that amazing and very powerful speech, and also for answering our audience's questions. I would now like to invite Joanna MurraySmith to speak. Before I do, though, I want to take a moment to thank all the members of the MurraySmith family for their support of this lecture over nearly 30 years and for their ongoing engagement with and support of the State Library. The number of people who've joined us tonight speaks to the esteem in which this lecture is held and the need and thirst for the public contest of ideas. I think it speaks volumes too about the strength and importance of Stephen Murray-Smith's legacy. Now, please welcome Joanna Murray-Smith.
Hi, well, first of all, thank you so much, Erik, about which more in a moment. I'd like to thank Joe and Susie Gaspar and say how sorry we are that Kate Tawney isn't here, on behalf of my sister and brother and myself. But mostly, of course, I'd like to thank Erik. These Stephen Murray-Smith lectures, well, they remind me of my father. My father wrote a little literary autobiography, which was prefaced with a quote from Hamlet's Polonius: "By indirections, find directions out." And these Stephen Murray-Smith lectures, so generously hosted by the State Library, have all been fascinating and often passionate indirections from a variety of distinguished Australians who have collectively stimulated us to find national and even personal directions. Erik is now one of these distinguished voices, and I thank him very, very much for agreeing to do this year's Stephen Murray-Smith Memorial Lecture. You spoke so eloquently, Erik, and I have to say, as both a writer and my father's daughter, I appreciated your ability, a journalistic ability, to say so much, but with great economy and great clarity, which is not always the case, and was really wonderful. I know my three kids, will have received those words, and some years that's harder than other years. So many of the things that you raised are fascinating. I was particularly interested in the troubling question, which I think most of us struggle with, particularly here in North Fitzroy, of sympathy absolving us from action and responsibility. The idea of a single image, which makes us somehow larger and more complete. That I immediately remembered smuggling a photograph of the Russian invasion of Prague out of Prague with mum and dad in a combi van in 1971, and the power of that photograph, the fear of it being discovered at the border, but the power of understanding what it meant when mum and dad explained it to me. And I'm very interested, I think maybe possibly as a playwright as well, in the idea of the dispassion of journalism versus anger. And I wonder, I was thinking as you were speaking about whether if the journalist supplies the anger, it somehow subdues the anger of the reader. And certainly with audiences, you know, sometimes the expressing of anger on the stage actually supplants the anger of the reception. So I think that's a really, really fascinating subject, and thank you so much for raising it. I've never heard anybody really talk about that before, so that was a wonderful surprise and incredibly stimulating. Now, sadly, Cleve, David and I are orphans. In fact, we would never have existed if the obsession with borders had, you know, been around in 1952 to the 60s. I think that now that we're orphans, now that Mum has died, we find these lectures even more important as they keep our parents alive in the public sphere and celebrate their incredible engagement with Australia and the world of ideas, and their compassion and their social conscience and their belief fundamentally in a diversity of voices, including, as you raised yourself, the importance of hearing from voices that we don't necessarily agree with. So as a journalist, as a literary editor, as a public intellectual, you're young, you're angry, but you have a belief fundamentally in the possibility of change. And all of those things remind me very much of Stephen MurraySmith, our wonderful dad. And on behalf of Cleve, David and myself, and the MurraySmith clan, thank you very, very much for all the hard work and incredible thought and wonderful contribution to our public life that this year's lecture was. Thank you.
Thank you so much.